Dear students, we'll see the sixth module today. So in the sixth module, the first topic that we'll be discussing is what is the need for various factory acts that has been introduced by the Constitution of India. So various legal provisions has been provided by the Constitution of India to the workers of various factories in order to safeguard the safety as well as health of their workers. The employer is to provide a very safe working condition to the working people in a particular industry. So various hazards has to be addressed by them and preventive measures has to be taken by the employers itself. So all those are indicated by the various factory acts introduced in India. Now, the concern of safety is primarily for the person who is working in a particular industry, his fellow employees, the contractors, visitors, various customers, and the society itself. So, considering the Constitution of India, various articles has been introduced to safeguard the health as well as to provide the safety of the workers. That is Article 39, which deals with the health and safety of the employees. Article 42, Article 43A, Article 24, dealing with the child labor prohibition, etc., has been included in the Constitution of India. Now various ILO stands for International Labour Organization. Conventions has also been done, that is Convention 81, Convention 136, Convention 170, etc. in order to provide good working condition for the various people. So we have already seen in previous modules about the OSHA regulations that has to be followed in every industry. Now, National Policy on Safety, Health and Environment at Workplace is introduced in the year 2010 in order to and the main motto of that policy is that safety is a fundamental human right. There is a Department of Factories and Boilers under the Ministry of Labour which look after the safety, health and welfare of the various workers employed in factories in Kerala. So moving on to the Factories Act 1948. So various provisions has been introduced in this particular Factory Act, and we'll see the important provisions in the Factories Act. So an act to consolidate and amend the law regulating labor in various factories, and it extends to the whole of the India. So we'll see the various provisions of the Factories Act. So in the year 1881, so going through the history of Factory Acts, in the year 1881, a factory was introduced, or rather factory is defined as a group of people working, coming around 100 workers working for a particular course. And the hours of work for children, etc., were defined in the year 1881. Later in the year 1891, the definition of the factory is redefined as 50 workers. Now the hours of work for the female workers as well as the rest intervals, etc., were added as provisions in the year 1891. Later 1911, 1919, etc., you can see that the different years what all provisions were added with the Factory Acts. Finally, 1948, a Factory Act was introduced with various responsibilities of the occupier, various health provisions, welfare facilities, etc., which was covered under the 1948 Factory Act. Later, various amendments were also introduced in the Factory Act. So the objective of the Factory Act is to promote safety, health and welfare for all the workers employed in a factory. So the Factory Act, it comprises of 11 chapters, with chapter 1 which is the preliminary, chapter 2 the inspecting staff, and so on. So you can see there are 11 chapters and various headings under each chapter. Now, according to the Factory Act, the factory can mean any premise which includes the various, you can define the factory based on various things. That is, it can be either 10 or more workers which are working on any day of preceding 12 months in any part of a manufacturing process, and so on. So that is one of the definitions. So the other definition is where around 20 or more workers are working. So you can see that the Factory Act defines the factory based on various facilities that is available in a working condition. Now, what do you mean by a notified factory? So these are definitions which is included in the Factory Act. So you can see the definition of a notified factory. Then, as well as you can see what is an MH, that is a factory which deals with the hazardous chemical, that is storing as well as the using of those hazardous chemical. So that comes under the MH factory. Now, what do you mean by a manufacturing process worker power? So all these are contained in the Factory Act of 1948. What do you mean by a manufacturing process? So it means either making, altering, repairing, ornamenting, etc. Then comes in abolishing or otherwise treatment as well as adapting of any material or substance. So that's one of the definitions. Now, pumping oil, so that is another category. Then comes the generating, transforming. So all these comes under the processing. Then the fourth part is the composing types of printing. So all these comes under manufacturing process. Then the fifth division is the constructing, reconstructing, repairing, then preserving or storing any articles in cold storage. So all these come under manufacturing process. Now, what do you mean by an adult, an adolescent, child, or competent person? So the definitions are also properly given in the Factory Act. Now, what do you mean by a worker? So it means a person who is employed directly or through any agency. So that is a worker. So the definition of a worker. Then what do you mean by power? It can be either electrical power or any other form of energy which is mechanically transmitted. So that is a definition of power regarding the Factory Act of 1948. Then what do you mean by an occupier? An occupier of a factory is a person who is the ultimate control over the affairs of the factory. For example, in the case of a firm or association of individuals, it is always a person or an individual partner who is responsible. Whereas if you're talking about a company, any one of the directors can be regarded as the occupier. Now, considering a company which is owned by the central or state government or any local authority, the person appointed to manage the factory, that person is the occupier. So all these are regarding the Factory Act of 1948. Now, what do you mean by a factory license? So a license is the approval for a particular factory to work. So how the permission has been issued and how the license is carried out for various manufacturing process, all these are coming under the factory license. Now, another thing is how the license is getting renewed. So the license which has to be renewed every year, the application should be submitted on or before 31st of October. Now, the next is the duties of the occupier of a factory. So we have already seen what an occupier is. So what are the general duties of occupier? So all this, the primary duty is to provide the health and safety as well as the welfare of the workers in a factory. So that's the primary duty of an occupier. Then different provisions or different categories of duties that the occupier has to perform is being discussed. That is the provision and maintenance of plant and systems of the work that are safe or without any risk. So all this has to be taken care by the person who is in charge. So all these are the main duties. Now, there is another category called inspectors. Those persons are appointed they are of prescribed qualification and they are appointed as the inspectors to see what is happening in an industry. So whom all to appoint and what are their duties? So inspectors are mainly public servants who has to serve the worker class of the people. Now what are the different powers of inspectors? So they can enter the particular industry with any with assistance any time they desire. Then they can examine the premises, plan machinery, etc. So all the inspectors as well as the observers, everyone has been introduced so as to provide safety as well as the welfare of the workers only. So all these are the duties or powers of the inspectors. So summing up the Factories Act, you can see there are various checklists. That is, what is the applicability of the act, what is the employer to ensure the health of workers pertaining to the various sections. So you can see that all these, the Factory Acts can be summed up in this particular this PPT, that is what are the various offences regarding the Factory Acts and what are the various penalties, how the annual leave has to be given, what are the different welfare measures, what are the working hours. So all the Factory Act has been summed up in this particular presentation, in this particular page. So you can go through the Factory Act of 1948. Now later on, various amendments were also introduced, such as in the year 1987. So the Factories Amendment Act has been introduced, or the objective is to provide for the safeguards to be adopted in using and handling various hazardous substances, to lay down emergency standards and measures, then to lay down procedures for citing of hazardous industries, and to ensure workers' participation in safety management. So in addition to all the provisions provided in the Factory Act 1948, these 4 preambles were also introduced. So summing up the various changes, such as introduction of portable electric light in various factories, then the safety officers, we have already seen the duties of the safety officers. So in the Act of 1987, Factory Act, the amendment, you can see why safety officers has to be introduced and what are the various roles and duties of safety officers is also written. Then it is also said that if for the case of various fatal accidents, investigations has to be done within a month. Then about the various health surveys that has to be introduced. Then the protection of contract labor, as well as any not only permanent laborers but also contract or temporary workers need also be protected. Then precious facility that is to be available if there is more than 30 working women in that particular industry. Then the dismissal of various workers, what has to be done or what is the why dismissal has been done. All such should be done with proper rules, or should be done according to proper rules and regulations. Then what are the different penalties for different offences, that is the rates modified and revised. So this comprises the Factory Act, the various categories or the provisions of the Factory Act, and what was the amendments in the Factory Act which is introduced in the year 1987.